Heavy rain poured over Accra, Ghana, turning the streets into shining rivers of gray. Inside the family court building, the air felt cold and heavy. Kwame Badu, 38, stood near the courtroom door holding the divorce papers in his shaking hands. His fingers felt numb but his face stayed calm. He took a slow breath and walked inside. Across the room, Alma Surwa sat like a queen on her throne. She wore an expensive red dress, her hair perfectly styled, her lips painted with confidence. Next to her sat Kofi Mensah, her rich boyfriend, wearing a sharp black suit and a proud smile. His arm rested on her chair like he already owned her. Alma looked at Kwame and smirked. Not a single tear filled her eyes. Not a second of regret showed on her face. The judge placed the papers in front of her. She didn't even read them. She picked up the pen and signed quickly, almost excited. Then she leaned closer to Kwame. He could smell her expensive perfume, the same one he once bought her with his savings. She whispered, her voice cold and sharp. "You were always the poorest mistake of my life." The words stabbed deeper than any knife. For a moment the world went silent. But Kwame didn't react. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply looked at the floor, quiet and still. Not because he was weak, but because he knew something she didn't. Something that would change everything. And in exactly 17 minutes, her smile would disappear forever. Kwame Badu was never the type of man to catch the eye with fancy clothes or flashy cars. He wore simple shirts and trousers, the kind that didn't shout for attention. His car, an old Toyota that had seen better days, rumbled down the streets of Accra. Nothing like the shiny SUVs Alma always dreamed of. At work he was steady, quiet, and reliable. A logistics supervisor who kept the wheels turning but never sought praise or recognition. That was Kwame, humble, consistent, and honest. Alma Surwa hated it. She had grown up seeing wealth as the measure of a person, and Kwame didn't fit her idea of success. Every time they went out she couldn't help but notice the men in East Legon driving flashy cars, wearing designer suits and showing off their wealth. She compared him to all of them, whispering insults when she thought he couldn't hear. "So weak, so small, ordinary," she said one night, tossing his worn jacket onto the floor. She wanted more. She wanted someone who could give her status, luxury, attention. And Kwame, he was none of that. Her complaints didn't stop with words. Over time Alma began looking elsewhere. That's when Kofi Mensah entered the picture. A loud, arrogant businessman who loved the spotlight and even more loved humiliating Kwame. Kofi laughed at Kwame's old car, mocked his quiet manner and flaunted his wealth in front of everyone. At parties, in restaurants, even on social media, Alma made no effort to hide her growing interest in Kofi. To outsiders the story was clear. Kwame was the loser, the man left behind, while the flashy, successful one took the prize. But what everyone failed to see was Kwame's silence. He didn't yell, he didn't fight, and he didn't beg. He listened, he observed, and he waited. Patience was his quiet strength, even if nobody recognized it. While Alma chased status and appearances, Kwame stayed steady, focused on the life he was building quietly. People thought he was weak because he didn't react to her taunts or Kofi's mockery. What they didn't realize was that true strength didn't need to shout. It didn't need flashy cars, expensive suits, or public applause. Kwame was building something bigger than Alma could see. A life that could survive betrayal, laughter, and humiliation. And soon enough, the patience he had shown for years would pay off in a way no one, especially Alma, could ever imagine. Kwame wasn't the loser anyone thought he was. He was the man who had been waiting quietly for his moment to arrive. And that moment was closer than anyone suspected. 3 months before the courtroom showdown, Kwame's father, Nana Badu, had passed away quietly in their hometown of Kumasi. It wasn't a big event. There were no grand announcements, no bustling crowds. Just a small gathering of family and a few close friends. To the world, it seemed like the passing of an ordinary man. Nobody paid much attention. Nobody cared. Alma, of course, didn't even bother to show up. She called the funeral a waste of time, rolling her eyes when Kwame mentioned it. She couldn't understand why he wanted to spend a day mourning someone who, to her, seemed like just a simple, poor old man. She never bothered to ask about Nana Badu, never cared to know him beyond her husband's life and what he could, or couldn't, give her. But what Alma didn't know, and what nobody else did, was that Nana Badu had always been private, extremely private. People saw him as quiet, simple, maybe even poor. He never flaunted money, never spoke about his achievements, and he stayed away from the kind of gossip and social climbing Alma loved. While everyone judged him by appearances, he quietly built a life that few could imagine. Kwame had always known his father was different, but he didn't know just how different. Nana Badu had worked hard, invested wisely and kept his successes hidden, not out of shame but out of a principle: humility. He believed true wealth didn't need to be shown. True power didn't need an audience. Before he passed, Nana Badu made arrangements for Kwame, but he never spoke about them. No letters, no big announcements, nothing that would hint at the treasure waiting. It was his secret, his way of protecting Kwame until the right time. And because he trusted Kwame to be patient and wise, he left everything in a way that would change his son's life forever. But only when the moment was right. Kwame felt a mix of grief and curiosity. He mourned his father quietly, respecting his ways, never imagining that what he had lost would soon become the key to a new beginning. What seemed like an ordinary death in a small town was actually the start of an extraordinary turning point. Nana Badu's life, hidden behind simplicity and silence, was about to rewrite Kwame's entire world. And Amma, who had dismissed him as poor all these years, was about to find out that she had been blind to the truth all along. Kwame had inherited more than money. He had inherited wisdom, patience, and a secret so powerful that it would shatter assumptions, silence mockery, and finally prove that appearances can be deceiving. What Amma thought was weakness was actually the calm before a storm. And that storm was ready to hit. The courtroom was tense, but Amma Surwa didn't care. She leaned back in her chair, laughing openly with Kofi Mensah, her boyfriend, as if they were sharing a private joke that the whole room could see. The sound of her laughter cut through the quiet like a knife. Even Kwame's own lawyer, who had always respected him, couldn't hide the small look of pity on his face. Everyone there seemed to think they knew the story. Kwame had lost, Amma had won. After today, Amma said, her voice loud and dripping with triumph, I'll finally live like I deserve. She let the words hang in the air, letting the courtroom feel her sense of victory. Kofi squeezed her hand, grinning as though he owned the moment, and perhaps even Kwame himself. Kwame kept his eyes down, staring at the polished wood floor. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply waited, calm, almost invisible to the room. People thought he was weak, that he had nothing left to give. But Kwame wasn't weak. He was patient. He had learned long ago that true power didn't need to shout or plead. The judge drummed his fingers on the bench, ready to finalize the divorce. Amma's smirk grew wider. She leaned back in her chair, confident that the rest of her life, wealth, status, luxury, was already hers. The courtroom seemed to hum with her triumph. And then, without warning, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Heads turned. The chatter stopped. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, curious and alert. A tall man walked in, his steps firm, his black suit crisp and commanding. His presence alone seemed to pull all the air from the room. Everyone paused. The man's eyes scanned the courtroom calmly, landing finally on Kwame. He carried himself with authority, holding a leather briefcase in one hand. There was no hurry, no panic in his movement, just a quiet confidence that made the murmurs in the room fall silent. Kwame slowly lifted his head and met the man's gaze. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He knew who had arrived. This was the person who could change everything in a single moment. The one who could turn humiliation into triumph. Amma froze mid-smile, her laughter dying on her lips. Kofi's hand loosened on hers. Something about the man radiated seriousness, power, and a warning that the game they thought they were winning was about to end. For the first time that day, the entire courtroom felt the shift in the air. The energy, the confidence, the quiet authority of the man in the black suit. It was like a storm had entered, and everyone, even Amma, could sense that nothing would ever be the same again. Kwame didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply waited, a small, almost invisible smile forming on his lips. The moment had come. And everyone in that courtroom, especially Amma, was about to witness it. The tall man in the black suit stepped forward, his movements calm but firm. He placed his briefcase on the floor and adjusted his tie before speaking. Your Honor, he said in a steady voice that made the courtroom fall silent, this divorce cannot be finalized yet. Amma Surwa's laughter died immediately, replaced with a look of irritation. She rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. What is this nonsense? She whispered to Kofi, who frowned in confusion. The judge, equally surprised, leaned forward on his bench, frowning. On what grounds? He asked, his tone sharp but curious. The lawyer's eyes met the judge's. Because Mr. Kwame Badu, he said slowly, emphasizing the name, is the sole beneficiary of his late father's will. The courtroom erupted, except for Kwame, who remained calm, almost serene. Alma blinked, her confident smirk faltering. His poor farmer father? She scoffed louder this time, her voice dripping with disbelief. She laughed nervously as if the idea itself were a joke. Kofi squeezed her hand, looking confused and unsure. The lawyer didn't smile. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers, neatly organized and sealed. "This," he said, holding up the documents, "is the last will and testament of Nana Badu, Kwame's father." He opened the first page and the room fell silent again. Even the judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses to read clearly. The lawyer began to read aloud, his voice calm and clear, carrying every word across the tense courtroom. "I, Nana Badu, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that my son Kwame Badu shall inherit all my assets, properties, investments and company shares. He is the sole beneficiary of my estate." Alma's eyes widened. Her lips parted but no words came out. Kofi's grip on her hand loosened. The whispers in the courtroom stopped. Even the lawyers and clerks who had seen countless cases sat quietly, stunned by the gravity of the announcement. As the lawyer continued to read, listing properties, businesses and investments, the truth hit Alma like a thunderbolt. Everything she thought she knew about Kwame, everything she had mocked and belittled, was about to be shattered in front of her. Kwame sat back, finally lifting his head. His eyes, calm and steady, met hers across the courtroom. He didn't gloat, didn't smile cruelly. He simply waited, knowing that patience and silence had brought him to this moment. The lawyer paused for a second, letting the words sink in. The room was frozen. Everyone stared at Kwame as if seeing him for the first time. And in that moment it was clear. Everything Alma thought she had won was about to slip away. The man in the black suit, Barrister Alyamide Adeyemi, had just changed the game. And nobody in that courtroom would ever look at Kwame the same way again. The lawyer's voice rang out clearly in the courtroom, steady and precise. "I, Nana Badu, leave to my son Kwame Badu." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. The room, which had been full of chatter, laughter and smug confidence moments before, suddenly fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward Kwame. The lawyer continued, reading slowly so that each word sank in. "Multiple commercial buildings in Accra, 3 luxury properties in East Legon, international investment accounts, and company ownership shares." He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of each item settle over the courtroom like a shadow. Alma's confident smirk faded. Her lips trembled slightly as she tried to hide the sudden shock washing over her face. Kofi Mensah's hand, which had been resting possessively over hers, slipped away slowly, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He glanced at her, eyes wide, and muttered under his breath. The lawyer leaned forward slightly, opening another page. "The total value of the estate left to Kwame Badu is $47 million. $47 million. The words echoed in the room like a physical force. Gasps whispered through the back rows. The judge leaned back in his chair, blinking rapidly, adjusting his glasses to make sure he read it correctly. The courtroom clerk froze mid-note. Even the other lawyers in the room stopped, pens hovering over paper, their mouths slightly open. Alma's face turned pale. The woman who had laughed, mocked and dismissed Kwame as poor and weak was now frozen in disbelief. For the first time that day she had no words. The arrogance, the confidence, the smug smile, it all vanished, leaving only shock and fear. Kwame meanwhile remained calm. His hands rested lightly on his lap. He didn't gloat. He didn't look angry. He just sat there letting the truth speak for itself. After years of being underestimated, humiliated and dismissed, he finally had the moment the world could not ignore. Everyone in the courtroom stared at him like they were seeing him for the first time. The man who drove an old Toyota, wore simple clothes and had been mocked endlessly, was now the owner of a multi-million-dollar fortune. The quiet, unassuming man they had laughed at had become someone untouchable, not because of arrogance but because of patience, wisdom and a father's careful planning. For Alma and Kofi, the world had flipped in an instant. The laughter, the mocking, the sense of victory, they were gone. All that remained was the stunned silence of people witnessing the truth unfold. And in that frozen courtroom Kwame finally had the power they had thought he never had. Alma Serwa shook her head over and over, unable to process what she had just heard. Her confident smile, the one that had been glued to her face all morning, was gone. Her voice trembled as she whispered almost to herself, This isn't real." She looked around the courtroom hoping someone would tell her she was mistaken, that it was some kind of joke. But the judge, his face serious and calm, confirmed every detail. Everything was legal. Everything had been verified. There was no mistake. Suddenly, Alma remembered something that made her stomach drop. The papers. The divorce papers. He had just signed them. Only moments ago she had mocked Kwame, scolded him silently in her mind for being poor, and leaned back with a sense of victory she now realized was completely misplaced. She had divorced him without knowing the full truth. And the truth? Kwame Badu was not just an ordinary man. He was a multimillionaire. The weight of it hit her like a physical blow, making her knees weak. Her hands shook as she looked at him, trying to find some flaw, some weakness, anything that would explain why she had misjudged him all these years. But there was nothing. Kwame sat there, calm, collected, his eyes steady, his posture unshaken. He wasn't smiling cruelly. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. For the first time Alma truly saw him. She saw the man she had underestimated, belittled, and abandoned. She saw the quiet strength that had always been there, hidden beneath simple clothes, an old Toyota, and a humble life. And she realized, too late, that she had destroyed her own chance at being with him. She had walked away from someone who had more integrity, patience, and wisdom than she could ever imagine. Kwame looked at her, and in his gaze there was no anger, no revenge, just calm closure. The kind of closure that comes from knowing you waited, you stayed true, and the truth finally revealed itself at the right moment. Alma's face turned pale. Her chest tightened. The confident, powerful woman who had walked into the courtroom like she owned the world now felt powerless. Like everything she had believed about herself and him had crumbled. She had gambled on appearances, on wealth she thought she could chase, and now she was left with the bitter truth. She had misjudged everything, including her own heart. And as she sat there, stunned and trembling, Kwame's calm presence spoke louder than any words ever could. He didn't need to yell, argue, or prove anything. He had waited, and the truth had finally spoken for him. In that moment, Alma understood just how deeply she had miscalculated, and how completely she had lost. The courtroom doors swung open, and Kwame walked out into the pouring rain, the sound of water hitting the pavement blending with the pounding of his heart. He kept his head high, his steps steady, and his mind calm. He had won more than money. He had won peace, truth, and the freedom of finally being seen for who he really was. Alma Surwa stood at the top of the steps, her heels slipping slightly on the wet stone. Her expensive dress clung to her now damp skin, and her makeup had begun to streak. She had tried to stay composed inside, but the moment she saw Kwame leave, something inside her snapped. She ran after him, her hands outstretched, her voice shaking. "Kwame, please, wait," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "We can fix this." "No. I didn't know." Kwame slowed his pace but didn't turn immediately. The rain soaked his hair and jacket, but he didn't flinch. He stopped only when she was close enough for him to hear every desperate word. He turned slowly, his face calm, almost sad, and looked at her one last time. "You didn't love me when I had nothing," he said, his voice steady and quiet, but each word cut deeper than any scream could. He paused, letting her hear the truth she had ignored for years. "You don't deserve me when I have everything." Alma's knees weakened. She dropped to the ground, collapsing into the puddles forming on the steps. The same woman who had mocked him, laughed at him, and signed divorce papers without a second thought was now broken in front of him. The proud, confident smile was gone. Her hands trembled as she covered her face, sobbing uncontrollably, begging silently for what she could never have. Kwame didn't reach out to help her. He didn't need to. He had nothing left to prove. His patience, his strength, and his integrity had already spoken louder than words ever could. The woman who had thought herself in control had finally realized she had lost. Not just him, but the respect, the chance, the love she had taken for granted. He turned back to walk away, his steps firm in the wet streets. The rain soaked his clothes, but it felt cleansing, washing away the years of mockery, humiliation, and quiet suffering he had endured. Behind him, Alma remained on the steps, drenched and sobbing, the reality of what she had lost crushing her. Kwame kept walking, not looking back, not needing closure from her. His freedom, his worth, and his peace were his alone. And in that moment he understood something even more powerful than wealth. Some victories don't come from fighting. They come from patience, dignity, and knowing your own value long before the world does. Alma had begged him to stop, but Kwame had already moved on, and she had no choice but to watch him go. A few days after the courtroom drama, Kwame found himself back in Kumasi, standing quietly in front of his father's grave. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and calm, and the soft breeze carried the faint smell of earth and flowers. He knelt down, placing his hands on the cool, damp soil, and looked at the simple stone that marked Nana Badu's resting place. He didn't feel rich. He didn't feel powerful. All the money, the buildings, the shares, the fortune, none of that mattered in this moment. What Kwame felt was something far deeper. He felt peace. A calm that he had never known while living under Alma's criticism, while enduring the public humiliation, while pretending to be smaller than he truly was. Kwame closed his eyes and remembered the quiet strength of his father. Nana Badu had been a man who understood life in a way most people never could. He had taught Kwame without ever saying it directly, that true wealth wasn't measured in money or possessions. True wealth was knowing your worth, standing by your values and having the courage to be yourself even when the world mocked you. Sitting there on the grass, Kwame realized the greatest gift his father had left him wasn't the fortune that had stunned Alma or the courtroom. It was the freedom to be himself. Freedom from people who only saw him as a man to be laughed at when he had nothing. Freedom from people who measured love and loyalty by money. That was priceless. That was everything. He thought about Alma running after him, begging, crying, realizing too late what she had lost. He didn't feel anger or revenge. He didn't feel satisfaction from her pain. What he felt was clarity. He had always been free even before the inheritance in ways she could never understand. Now with the truth fully revealed, that freedom was absolute. Kwame stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting golden streaks across the cemetery. It felt like a sign, a reminder that even after storms, both literal and metaphorical, peace always comes. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh air, and smiled softly. For years he had been underestimated, humiliated, and ignored. But now, standing there in Kumasi, Kwame understood that none of that had broken him. It had prepared him. His father's quiet lessons, his patience, his humility, had brought him to a place where he could finally live without fear, without pretense, and without needing approval from anyone who only loved him for his possessions. Kwame walked away from the grave slowly, feeling light, calm, and truly free. The fortune he had inherited would serve him well, yes, but it was nothing compared to the knowledge that he had already won the most important thing in life, the freedom to be himself, unshaken by anyone's judgment or envy. And in that freedom, Kwame finally smiled in a way that came from deep inside. A smile that no one, not even Alma, could ever take away. 1 year later, Kwame Badu's life looked different to the outside world, but for him very little had changed. He now owned and ran all of his father's businesses, commercial buildings in Accra, luxury properties in East Legon, international investments and company shares. On paper he was wealthy beyond imagination. But Kwame still drove his old Toyota. He still wore simple clothes. He still walked through the streets of Accra with the same calm, humble presence that people had always underestimated. Wealth hadn't changed him. It hadn't made him arrogant or loud. His heart remained steady, kind, and grounded. Alma Serwa, meanwhile, had lost her footing completely. Kofi, her rich boyfriend who had once seemed so untouchable, had left her. The expensive clothes, the flashy cars, the parties, they meant nothing now. She had spent years chasing money and status, and in the end, it had all slipped through her fingers. The woman who had mocked Kwame, laughed at him, and signed the divorce with such certainty, was left with nothing but regret and a pale memory of her own mistakes. Kwame didn't gloat. He didn't rub his success in her face. Because for him, the victory had never been about money. It had been about truth, patience, and understanding his own worth long before anyone else did. He had been mocked, underestimated, and humiliated, but none of that had broken him. Instead, it had prepared him for this moment, a moment of quiet triumph that no one could take away. And Alma? She had walked away thinking she was escaping a poor man. But the truth was far harsher than she could have imagined. She had walked away from her greatest blessing. Kwame's life wasn't measured by money. It was measured by patience, dignity, and the power of knowing his own value. She signed the divorce thinking she was escaping a poor man, but she was really walking away from her greatest blessing.